All right, ladies and gentlemen, so we're going to start by looking at now the trends of natural selection. So what happens when nature, the environment, selects for or against a certain trait, be it a single gene trait, a trait controlled by one gene, or a trait controlled by many genes known as polygenic traits. So this is called directional selection. Directional selection is when one end of a phenotype range is favored over another. So for instance, number in a population and beak size. Okay, so if this is the curve that shows beak size, the peak up here is going to shift as the average beak size increases. All right, we can see that happening in this chart. This dashed line is the original curve we're looking at in color, and as this peak shifts, aka an average beak size increase, this entire curve has to shift to the right as well. And that is directional selection, selecting one direction, one extreme over the other. Average beak size could have also decreased, and our peak on this graph would have went to the left instead. So that is directional selection. Now, then we have something called stabilizing selection, where it's selection against both extremes of the curve. And what happens is, initially you might have a dashed line, a dashed curve like this, showing traits in a population that might show a more even distribution of traits. But then this stabilizing selection actually favors these traits in the middle, right? The environment that these organisms are in, this middle part is favored. So our curve goes from this pretty broad base to more of a bell curve, more of a narrow curve with much more of a peak, as you can see here, because the middle, the average, is what is favored. And then we have something called disruptive selection. Now, disruptive selection is the opposite of both stabilizing and directional, because disruptive selection favors the extreme versions of a trait, basically selecting against the average or the middle road of the trait, if you will. So if we go back to beak size, if this was the dashed line here, if this was the beak size initially in the environment, and then the environment changed for whatever reason so that this average beak size was unfavorable, and it was either better to have a small beak or better to have a very large beak, then we would have a disruptive selection event happening where the two extremes are favored. Now, there's also this concept of genetic drift, right? Genetic drift is like the random change in allele frequencies that occurs in small populations due to chance. Okay, remember, because chance is a big part of all of this. And don't forget, alleles are homologous chromosomes from different parents. Okay? So your alleles are genes. Okay, so alleles. This is from Unit 5. I want to explain it to you in a way you're going to remember. Alleles are same gene, different versions of that gene on homologous chromosomes. Okay, so in our example here, we have a sample of the original population. Here are the originals, and here are the originals. Okay, over time, here are the descendants, and here are the descendants. All right, you can see there's a little bit of change. There's a little bit of favoring happening over some other phenotypes, and that's genetic drift. It's all due to chance. All right, chance interactions, and the environment could favor all of these phenotypes and not really consider one better over the other. So we have some examples of genetic drift here, and what I want you to do is I want you to click on these examples and read about them. So we have the drastic reduction in population, where only surviving individuals produce future populations. All right, that's called the bottleneck effect. Then we have the founder effect. So this is if a new habitat is colonized, then those individuals may carry alleles in a different allele frequency than the larger population that they came from. So this founder effect is like when a population is made and then a small piece of that population goes somewhere else. That small sample of that original population will have a different allele frequency, right? Different frequencies of gene variants happening within them. Okay, so what we have here is an example of the bottleneck effect, and we use a literal bottle to display this. So we have the original population, the original allele frequency, then hunting of seals in the late 1800s greatly reduces population size, and then the surviving population had an allele frequency and had different allele frequency and very little genetic diversity. And this different allele frequency is reflected in today's population. All right, and then up top above here, you can see I'm actually using a bottle to represent the bottleneck effect. Okay, so basically before massive hunting, these seals had a much wider range of diversity, which we know genetic diversity is so important for any population of organisms. But then in their current population, because of the hunting, because of the reduction of allele frequency in the surviving members, the population today has a lower amount of genetic diversity. Okay, so I want you to read this link, please. Please click on this and read it. It's very important. And then I want you to think of more founder effects that you can think of off the top of your head in life today. Okay, so the ecological race. A population of the same species that differs genetically from one another, from other populations of the same species because they adapted to different environments. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, okay, here's time. Time moves this way. We have the original population. Then we have reproductive isolation within this population and within this population. And then we have speciation within these populations. So basically all that means is you can have populations of the same species that are going to be genetically different because they've adapted to different environments. And over time, you can have a species in the woods and a species in the desert, and they can be the same species, but over time, because of their isolation from each other in these environments, a speciation event will happen where they become different species. Let's talk about isolation in the next one, folks.